Hello, my name is Alex Iles, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at the Gladiator 2 trailer and finding out, are you not entertained? Welcome back. So, if you're still here after that introduction, that's fantastic. But in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the Gladiator 2 trailer. I was away on holiday last week and obviously the trailer came out and I tried to save it to basically sit down and have a real think about how I was going to do this. So I sat down with a pen and paper and went scene by scene through, taking notes and really thinking about the Gladiator 2 trailer. Because first and foremost, and I've looked at a lot of the different comments in different groups online, the commentaries from the journalists, all of that sort of thing, and as always, things have got decisive. I mean, it's the 21st century, of course things have got decisive. But I wanted to go in from this, looking at it both as history, looking at the actual history, the archaeology and all of that, but also as a piece of entertainment. I want to say from the outset is that I have very fond memories of Gladiator 1. The first Gladiator film, I was a young child and I got to see this amazing Roman, Maximus, and his amazing ability to lead people even though he was a slave, and the entertainment of the arena, the battle scene at the start, everything about it captivated me and in many ways probably inspired some of my love and my passion for Roman history and Roman culture, as I'm sure it did many other people as well. Looking back on it now, with the studies I've done, the research I've done, all of that sort of things, there are many things that I look at the first film and I go, well actually, that wasn't as accurate as I thought it was when I was growing up. For instance, Commodus is depicted by Joaquin Phoenix and he's quite wet and obviously has issues with the fact that he feels his father's never loved him and stuff like that. The real Commodus was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was huge, he had huge muscles and he depicted himself as Hercules. He was go into the arena and fight, and he actually charged Rome 1,000,000 sesterces a time for his appearances, which he dictated. So it was quite an interesting guy. It's kind of like, I don't know, a footballer who owns his own club, you know, that sort of thing. The idea that he could then charge whatever he wanted, go out onto the pitch and then basically do whatever he fancied and no one could stand against him. That kind of energy and attitude in Commodus. And obviously he was the last of his father's sons. All of his other sons had died in tragedies and in plague and things like that. So he was the last son. His father had fought for years fighting in wars. And basically, if you look at Commodus, he's a perfect example of a child who never felt loved, desperately needed to be loved. So he made himself into a superstar athlete, really in the arena, having to force the crowd to love him. And then eventually went and became a megalomaniac. And the last 2 years of his life are really tragic, where basically he becomes more and more infatuated, sets himself up as like a divine person, and the Senate eventually organizes for him to be assassinated by his lover and slave. So, you know, in the bathtub. So you see this sort of like transition as you follow the life of this person through the histories. And when you see the Gladiator film, obviously they compact all of that megalomania down into a few short years, and obviously the effect of that with the questions of his relationship with his sister and the young character as well, Lucius, his nephew. So now I'm going to analyse Gladiator 2 and to really go through the trailer and talk about the things that were really drawn out to me in discussing them in full. Now, to start off with, I felt the trailer was quite long. 3 minutes is actually quite a heavy-hitting trailer, and so there's a lot of information in there. I felt a bit physically tired, actually, at the end of it, because I was pausing, taking notes, that sort of stuff, and I'd have to say that, personally, if I was going to do a trailer, I wouldn't do it 3 minutes long. I would cut it down a bit shorter so that people have more to look forward to, because I feel now, at the end of this, that I know the plot of the film. I kind of know what's going to happen, and there's a little bit of disappointment in me where I'm like, I wish I could, know less, so there was more excitement in me to go into the actual cinema. but I'll discuss that at the end with my feelings about the whole trailer and my whole thoughts. So stick around to the end, and if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe, because I think you'll enjoy the content I produce on this channel, and there's plenty more stuff like this as well, where I go into the history and archaeology of various different topics. But let's get into the trailer. So we start off with Lucius. And so Lucius was the young lad in Gladiator 1 who is heavily implied to be the son of Maximus and Lucia. So when he's heavily implied that, the suggestion is that Maximus had a romance with Marcus Aurelius' daughter, and then from the result of that is Lucius. So there's always that threat over him of, will Commodus kill him, or that sort of stuff in the first film. In the opening seconds of the trailer, we see a young Lucius reliving elements of the first film, followed by him then being in a dusty, arid environment, being chased by Roman cavalry, and then it is implied that he was captured, turned into a slave, and then over time has become a gladiator. So that's a really interesting one there, that development where we see that at the end of the film he was on the winning side. His mother had managed to have this great impassioned speech about restoring the Republic. At the start of Gladiator 2, we have to understand that that probably has failed. Now, this is entirely fictional, obviously. At this point in the end of the 2nd, start of the 3rd century, the idea of restoring the Republic would have been a pipe dream, entirely impossible. The emperors were too built into it, and even though the Senate always had the idea of the romance of the Republican period coming back again, the reality was that they had accepted that they would always try and promote from within themselves to actually appoint the next emperor. And I actually have a series coming up on Roman politics, so if you're really interested in that, it'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks, and I think you'll really enjoy that as well. Now, when we've got this, we've got the young Lucius, and he's obviously looking up to Maximus, and we see him reaching up to take Maximus's sword and the sort of memorial that there is to him within the Colosseum. So that originally stages and gives us a background of what's actually going on, what's going to be the next steps of this film, and sets it all up. Now, in real life, we know that after the assassination of Commodus, there was a man called Pertinax who became the next emperor, and his father had actually been a slave, was released, and Pertinax had become very, very wealthy and actually bidded to become the next emperor. And he only lasted a few months before he was assassinated, which led to the year of 5 emperors, and then Septimius Severus becoming the next emperor. And he's going to become important because he's the father of the 2 antagonists within this film, Caracalla and Geta. So we'll have a look at that, and we'll be discussing him and his sons in a little bit more depth slightly later on in the episode. Now, following on in the trailer, we see Denzel Washington's character, Macrinius, speaking over the Colosseum. So you see a pan over the Colosseum, and he says, "This is the greatest temple ever built." Now, straight away, that sort of triggered me on the inside, because I was just like, oh, well, the Parthenon and the Pantheon disagree, and those two are amazing temples of the ancient world. And obviously, even after that, you've got some of the amazing synagogues, cathedrals, and obviously mosques all around the world that are absolutely gorgeous. But I understand the point that Ridley Scott's trying to make. What he's trying to make a point about is the idea of like the way that sport is used for social control, and the idea of like the bread and circuses that we see so heavily in the first film. The idea that we can control the masses as long as they have entertainment in front of them. You know, you think of stuff like the Super Bowl, the World Cup, things like that. The idea is that those are used by the elites to control the masses so that they don't notice their own poverty. And there's a strong sense of that I'm getting from this film, that this is an undertone that's being used, and that the Colosseum is just being used to control the Roman people. And I thought that was a wee bit heavy, but you can discuss that down in the comments section. Denzel Washington's character is actually supposed to represent one of the emperors from the crisis of the 3rd century. So with that being the case, maybe Ridley Scott is then following up that Denzel Washington's character at the end of the actual film is going to become the next emperor, which will be very interesting as well, and we'll discuss that a bit more later on. At 40 seconds in, we see a flooded Colosseum, and the flooding of the Colosseum is called a nautomachia. If I've mispronounced that, I do apologise. My Latin isn't as strong as I'd like it to be. But the whole point of it was that these were celebrations where they would have naval battles. One of the earliest ones was actually done for Julius Caesar when he came back from Gaul as a victory. And they dug an 1800 by 1200 foot dip in the Tiber, flooded it, and had a sea battle with 12 trimarines and 3,000 soldiers fighting to entertain the masses of Rome. Now later on, Emperor Titus, who was the son of Domitian, then did a similar thing where he flooded the Colosseum. And when he flooded the Colosseum, they had reenactments of some of the battles from classical history, especially of Athens versus Syracuse. And so when they had that, they would have soldiers fighting within the ships. And it was seen as a great spectacle, but was hugely, hugely expensive. And pretty much after Titus, it didn't really happen again because of the fact it would cost so much to actually do and to actually be able to enjoy. And later on, when they excavated the tunnels underneath the Colosseum, it became fully impossible to flood the Colosseum again, simply because of the fact that water would leak through and it would cause a lot of damage. Now, often within these naval battles, they would use prisoners to actually do the entertainment. So they were actually condemned to death already. They would have to fight to the death, and they were really hoping that the emperor would spare them at the end of it. So this sort of blood sport entertainment was very, very popular for a short amount of time, but hugely expensive, with needing to get massive amounts of water, to get the ships inside the Colosseum, all of those sort of things as well. And to make the spectacle even more amazing, what they would do is they would actually flood the Colosseum while the audience were actually there. So they had to do the flooding very, very quickly, raise the ships up and have the battle, and they used flat-bottomed boats to actually enable them to deal with the shallow water within the Colosseum, because otherwise they just couldn't have actual real replica ships within there. Now, with all of that going on, you can't have a slow filling of the Colosseum, otherwise the audience is going to get bored. So they must have had some amazing engineering to enable this to happen. Ultimately, though, the expense of it and also the fact that the audiences got bored and actually just preferred watching gladiatorial combat instead basically meant that it's faded out and it stopped being a form of entertainment that the Romans did. So a combination of cost, the engineering of the Colosseum itself, and also the fact that ultimately the Roman audience found it boring basically meant this went away. In this scene as well, we also see one of the sailors on the ship get shot by an arrow and falls in the water. And when they fall in the water, out of nowhere a shark comes. Now, I'm going to suspend disbelief. As I said before, this is a piece of fiction. But the idea of the flooding of the Colosseum and then being able to bring sharks into it, it's just too much. It would have been hugely, hugely difficult. And if you look at the distance that Rome is actually from the Mediterranean Sea, you have to imagine that the person organising the games has had to find sharks, bring them all the way to Rome, keep them alive during that time, wait for them in a tank or something like that to then be placed into the Colosseum when it's flooded, and then at the end of it, you have to dispose them, which presumably they would just have been like, oh, well, they're just dead. It's a one-use entertainment thing, that sort of thing. But me and my friends online have been having a good joke about this, that when they pull the bath plug out of the Colosseum, that Rome is going to experience Sharknado. But that's just sort of the humour that we see. Again, I'm going to suspend disbelief because of the fact that this is a piece of fiction and it's inspired by rather than actually being real historical events. But I thought that was particularly silly and I found it quite just a bit of fun. But at the same time, I was just watching it. I was just like, sharks in the Colosseum. Of course, Ridley Scott. It's going to be something he does. You know, he's come fresh out of Napoleon, which has obviously caused quite a bit of controversy amongst those people who love historical films. And then suddenly, bam, sharks in the Colosseum. We're going to see some fun stuff in this, and we're going to continue and discuss that further. Then at around about 51 seconds in the trailer, we have Geta and Caracalla, and we see them for the first time. Now, this is where I'm going to touch on stuff that is controversial, sometimes difficult, and we'll discuss this in more depth. But please, when we get down to the comments, be civil with one another. I do ask of that at every video where we touch on stuff that's complicated, and it's really important that we face this in historical information and we deal with it appropriately. So please, when we come to this modern politics, I don't really want to see it in the comments section, and I don't want to do it, but I will remove comments that are offensive. But that's just important to say from the beginning. So first of all, we have to come back to Septimius Severus. So Septimius Severus was obviously, he's been pinned as the first African emperor. And when we look at that, there was a while ago, the BBC obviously and English Heritage have depicted him as being more black in his depictions and some of the pictures that have been done in recent history. We know that he was of Carthaginian ancestry. So on his father's side, he could trace back to the Carthaginians, and the Carthaginians were descended from the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians were a trading empire from the Levant in the area of modern-day Israel and Palestine. When they were in that area, they then set up colonies in the Western Mediterranean, with Carthage becoming more powerful, wealthier, and more important than its mother state of Phoenicia. So because of that, Carthage grows to become the really important area in the Western Mediterranean, and we had powerful Carthaginians such as Hannibal, who obviously went to war against the Romans. Eventually Rome conquers Carthage, and some of the Carthaginian elite then marry into Roman families. So we know Septimius Severus's mother was of Italic ancestry, she was a Roman. She married his father, who was of Carthaginian ancestry, and then we get Septimius Severus. And he is an equestrian of the knightly class of Rome. And what happens is during the reign of Antonius Pius, there's a plague, and he's one of the young and upcoming men within Roman politics. And so because of that, he is raised up to the senatorial classes, and then he is a legion commander in Pannonia during a period of instability, and eventually becomes the emperor himself. He marries Julia Domina, and Julia Domina is a Syrian. And so when he marries her, she is of Syrian and has Arabic ancestry as well. So with that, her sons have very strong Middle Eastern ancestry. So when you have that, we have busts of both Geta and Caracalla. And when you look at Caracalla and Geta, they have Middle Eastern features. And so when we have these reconstructed busts, we could almost imagine them being people that you'd see in the modern day Levant in the Middle East today. So what's interesting is that Ridley Scott has decided to be inspired more by people from the Julian-Claudian dynasty. So people like Caligula, Claudius, and also Nero. And we know that they had reddish blonde hair, they were paler in complexion, and they would lean into that. And in some ways, I think the representation of Caracalla that you see on the screen could look a bit more like what we think the historical Nero would have looked like. So it's interesting, he's kind of gone more for a Julio-Claudian look, rather than the Middle Eastern Septimian dynasty that we actually know from history existed. So when we've got that sort of clash there, again, I'm not trying to make this into modern politics, but it's really interesting in an age where representation and diversity are important to our societies, that Ridley Scott had this opportunity of showing off this really interesting dynasty and these characters, but he's chosen not to. And there's a part of me that worries that the reason he chose to do that was because of the fact that they are Middle Eastern, that he didn't want to portray them as the bad guys. Now, with that being the case, you could have done some really interesting stuff there with Geta and Caracalla, because the sources that we have of them always depict Caracalla as a tyrant, and I'll get into the reason why. So what happens is that Septimius Severus is campaigning in Britain. And when Septimius Severus is campaigning in Britain, he falls ill in York and he dies. And all the way back to 198 AD, Caracalla has been his co-emperor. So when he's been his co-emperor, he's been alongside his father. His father is the senior emperor, he is the junior emperor, so Augustus and a Caesar. And so they've been side by side, and then his little brother Geta has been brought up side by side with his older brother to be a co-emperor from 209 to 211. Their father falls ill while fighting against the people in what is now modern day Scotland. They come back to York and his father passes away. And his father on his deathbed turns to his sons and he says, you know, enrich the army and damn everyone else, ignore everyone else. And the sons, especially Caracalla, take that quite seriously. And what we know from Septimius Severus is that he was one of the emperors who basically ignored the Senate. The emperors were supposed to rule with legitimacy from the Senate. The Senate was supposed to authorize, to rubber stamp, to give legitimacy to the emperor as well. So they were supposed to be symbiotic. They were supposed to work together, with the emperor obviously leading and being the real power, but the Senate to be the legitimate body that would then honor the powerful and wealthy families in Rome. Septimius Severus doesn't really have that connection, and he just basically ignores the Senate, and the Senate really doesn't like him. So when he dies, they don't really care. They're actually quite thankful. But what happens is the Senate doesn't like dynastic emperors. They want someone else to be risen up instead, but instead they get Caracalla and Geta. Now, Caracalla and Geta do not get on. And when they do not get on, we actually have the fact that, well, first of all, I'll explain a bit more about Caracalla's name. His actual imperial name is Marcus Aurelius Antonius, because what happened is that the Septimian dynasty wanted to be seen as a continuation from Marcus Aurelius's dynasty. They wanted to be seen as an extension of that. And actually what Septimius Severus actually did was he sort of claimed Marcus Aurelius as a spiritual father, as an ancestor. And so because of that, it was seen as a legitimate inheritance following on from Marcus Aurelius, rather than it being a case of him being a usurper and a new sort of military dictator emperor. So because of that, he gave his son the ruling name of Marcus Aurelius Antonius, but he got the name Caracalla because that was the military cloak. And so he spent time with the army, and he was loved by the soldiers, and he was really seen as a soldier's emperor. In fact, he increases their wages from 500 to 750 denarius a year. So he enriches the army, he's seen as the military leader, and he's very, very popular with them. But him and his brother don't get on. And when him and his brother don't get on, their mother, Julia Domina, is basically seen as the political linchpin to try and bring them together. She's trying to cause peace. And the Romans had a winter festival called Saturnalia, which is sort of, if you think of it as, it's a generalization, but you could call it Roman Christmas. And when they have Saturnalia, she calls her sons together and she's just like, all right, lads, come sit down at the table, let's have a meal of Christmas dinner, let's chat it out, let's sort it out so you don't hate each other anymore, and you can be co-emperors and you can honor your father. So she sends the invitations, Geta turns up, and he sits down at the table with his mum, but Caracalla hasn't. Caracalla doesn't show, and they're sitting there at the dinner table wondering when Caracalla's going to come. 10 centurions burst into the room, drag Geta onto the table, and then proceed to stab him to death. Obviously, Julia Domina was a wee bit upset at her son of the fact he murdered his brother, and the empire was upset, but they made up, and then she continues to run the political side of the empire while her son rules the army and is really a field commander, and he really prefers some of the military aspects of ruling and is far more authoritarian. So the Senate really describes, and when we see the military histories and the histories written at the time, he's always described as a tyrant. So when he's described as a tyrant, maybe Ridley Scott instead could have leaned into this, instead made it look like the Senate were the wealthy, powerful, old men of Rome who don't like the fact that there's this new powerful emperor who's loved by the army and loved by the people, versus them who are seen as the money, powerful, wealthy individuals who are sitting in the ivory towers and looking down at him. And that's one way he could have done it. But I don't think that maybe would have hit home with the mark of what he's trying to do, because it seems like through a lot of his films, he's trying to put forward the idea of like democracy and the idea of like against tyrants and stuff like that sort of thing. So he doesn't want that. You just have to watch Robin Hood, and there's a strong democratic theme through it of the idea of these peasants trying to bring forth democracy versus the tyranny of monarchy, which, trust me, in 12th and 13th century England is not what's happening. But like, these are the sort of things that Ridley Scott's bringing into his films. So with this, rather than having, Geta and Caracalla as Mediterranean, stuff like that, he's gone instead for a much more Julio-Claudian look, with paler skin, ginger or red hair, blonde hair, that sort of stuff, and going for that sort of influence as well, so that he's not like having the idea of these tyrants being Middle Eastern, which possibly could get a political hit back with the story that he's trying to tell of like democracy and stuff like that. So it's probably where he's going to try and tell a story, which is the narrative he wants, and he's using the names rather than actually using the historical accuracy of it. So there's an interesting thing going on there. So then we cut onto a battle scene, and this is where Pedro Pascal's character Marcus comes in. So Pedro Pascal's character is actually not a historical person. He is a character who's been made up for the film. He's supposed to be Maximus's protege, so he was apparently trained by Maximus, and so he's got a connection with Maximus as well. So this might be the bridge character to connect Lucius to Maximus and to bring out some sort of like father-son connection and all of that sort of stuff, and mental connection as well. But when we see this guy, we see another one of Ridley Scott's tropes. He loves beach landings. He loves the idea of the sort of the D-Day-esque beach landing. And we see a naval invasion against an arid city, which could be either in North Africa or it could also be in the Middle East as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we actually know that during Caracalla's reign, he did fight in the Far East against the Parthians. So he went out and fought against them. But the border between the Romans and the Parthians is not a sea border. It would have been going through Mesopotamia into obviously Persia and fighting between those two nations there. So he fights against them, but he starts that in 216 AD and then he gets assassinated in 217 AD. So he never really gets to bring that war to fruition, even though he does have victories against the Parthians. Earlier on, Caracalla also fights against the Germans. And so when he fights against the Germans, he has victories over the Alemanni. And so from there, he has victories there as well. But we don't see him fighting in North Africa or possibly in the Middle East as well. But we see a scene between Marcus and also Caracalla and Geta, where he's saying, oh, the people need to be fed bread. And then they're saying, oh, feed them war. And the funny thing is again, we see Ridley Scott's democratic leanings coming through here. He's showing the tyrants, war-hungry Roman emperors versus this man who knows what the people need, which is bread and food and all that stuff. The funny thing is, as a general, he's probably senatorial or equestrian class, and he makes money, proper money out of warfare in Roman times, if this was realistic. And so why would you be saying that? The emperors are the core of the Roman Empire. These guys are the center of it. And if they have declared war, it's either for expansion, which is to create more, obviously, slaves or land or benefits for the empire, or alongside that as well, it's for defense or for fighting against Rome's enemies. So he would have been loyal to the emperors, unless he's obviously wanting to be a usurper himself. So we've got another interesting thing here, where we've got obviously Denzel Washington's character based on a crisis of the 3rd century emperor. We have Pedro Pascal's character. Are these the people who are possibly going to be the next imperial characters at the end of the film? It creates a little bit of a question mark of who are these characters, what are they going to do? But it's again a really interesting one right there. The other thing about the battle scene is that the soldiers are still very much depicted in what we describe as Hollywood Romans, which are based off Trajanic soldiers. So when we think of the Romans, often in Hollywood films and stuff like that, it's on Trajan's column that you see the image. And on Trajan's column we have Trajan fighting against the Dacians, or what is today modern Romania. And so we have a depiction of the Roman soldiers in the famous Lorica Segmentata, which is the banded plate armour, and also the famous helmets, the Gallic helmet and things like that. And they've got the large curved rectangular shields, and they are fighting against barbarians. Now, we can see that Hollywood has a lot of that armour left over, and they also make leather versions of it as well. So it's easier, it's lighter, and one of the main arguments against historical accurate armour in films is because of the fact that they're worried that the actors can't do multiple takes wearing armour, they'll get exhausted, and health and safety comes in. So props departments make leather armour instead. So that's why we see in Roman films, obviously, this depiction of the Roman soldier in leather armour, which we have no evidence for. Though some people advocate for it, I'm strongly against it because we have more than enough mail armour. Some people call it chainmail, but mail armour. We have scale armour, which is they're small little pieces of metal, often bronze, brass or iron, that are then sewn onto a jerkin and then create an effective form of armour. And as we're heading into the 3rd century, the early 3rd century, which is, if this was historically set in a period that we could be certain of when it would be set, the soldiers are now moving away from the Lorica Segmentata. There is still some of it left, but chainmail or mail armour has fully come in, scale armour is very popular, and excavations all over the Roman Empire from the 3rd century show scale scale armour and mail armour being the main forms of armour of the soldier of the period, the curved scutum, a rectangular scutum that you often see with Roman soldiers, is starting to go out of fashion as well. There is one example from a place called Dura Europus, which is still 3rd century, but we think that's more ceremonial, or it could be a town guard, whereas the actual round shield, large dished shield, is actually becoming more popular instead, and the helmet has also transformed as well, with it becoming longer. The bowl of the helmet now covers the back of the neck, larger cheek plates, and also a band across the top to provide more protection. And this is shown best with what's called the Niederbiber helmet. And the Niederbiber helmet is very much of the style of the 3rd century, and I'll come back to that later. But with that, the transformation of the soldier over time has actually changed in the 3rd century. They're not wearing the same equipment as the Trajannic soldier, but when we're seeing this naval landing and Pedro Pascal's character charging out, what we're seeing is very much a naval invasion of soldiers in the Trajannic Hollywood-style Romans, rather than a more modernized version. And one day I really hope that, you know, the costume designers will really lean into this and go, actually, yeah, we should do something like this. We should do historically accurate costumes and things, because there is some really amazing things coming out, especially amongst the reenactment scene, that really shows that this period was colourful and had fantastic armour and weapons that were practical, but also were incredibly showy as well, because the Romans loved showing off. Following on from that, we then get wonderful pans over Rome, and we get some lovely CGI versions of Rome in the 3rd century. I think these were really, really well done, and I think that was a nice thing, because there's a project called Rome in 3D, which you can search for online, and basically you get to pan across Rome and you get to see 3D scenes of Rome in the 3rd and 4th century. And so it's nice that they're taking influence possibly from academia, and they're learning and seeing that actually the city was vibrant and colourful, and was a leading city in Europe for certain, and was very much heavily influential on Middle Eastern cities that were older than it as well, but had sort of fallen away as Rome had risen up. So a hugely important one right there as well. In the next scene, we have a gladiator riding on the back of a rhino. Now what we've got is Lucius, the main character, and he's in the gladiatorial scene. He's organising the gladiators. So again, we're reminded of Maximus in the first film. The rhino comes out with the gladiator riding on his back. It charges, he throws dust up in the air, and the rhino charges into the wall. I thought that was a bit silly. I mean, obviously, you know, you'd think that they'd be prepared for people rolling out the way, dodging all of that stuff, and he's relying on it being too fast to stop. And so that's the whole point of the scene, is to show his tactics and his experience and his ability to lead men coming through, just like Maximus. And so you're seeing the parallels there. And while it does come across a little bit silly, we know the Romans used huge numbers of beasts in the Colosseum. So we know that they were using lions, leopards, elephants, hippopotamuses, giraffes, wolves, all of these sort of animals, as well as they would have hunting scenes against deer and cows and stuff like that as well. So they were very much trying to entertain the public, and anything the public maybe weren't so used to or was exotic or stuff like that would be brought into the Colosseum. So you could have hunting scenes, you could have combat against wild beasts, things that would show off the exotic East or the wild North or things like that. So it was all a part of the entertainment. So even though the scene comes across as a bit silly with the rhino and the gladiator on his back and all of that sort of stuff, it does have an influence there that I can forgive, even though the scene comes across as a little bit daft. The next scene, though, I find much harder to swallow at around about 1 minute and 57 seconds. We see, again, Lucius take a crossbow and shoot towards the emperors. Now, in my personal opinion, any gladiator who would, or probably a lot of other Roman historians as well, any gladiator who would try and take a life of an emperor would instantly be killed and would die horribly. Now, the reason for this is because the gladiators actually really looked up to the emperors. It was a great honor. So like, for instance, Commodus, who obviously is the main character in the previous film, when he went in dressed as Hercules and fought in the Colosseum, he never killed the gladiators. Instead, he would wound them or have blunted weapons and stuff like that. And the gladiators actually wanted wounds from the emperor because they were seen as semi-divine. They were seen as great leaders, and they were seen as fortuitous, actually lucky to actually have wounds from the emperor on your body. So the idea of a gladiator actually trying to shoot the emperor when this is the semi-divine core of the Roman Empire. No, no, I have to, my suspense of disbelief cracks at this point. But we do see something interesting. The crossbow he uses is inaccurate. But we do know that there was a late Roman weapon called an arqueballista. And the arqueballista, we know from two inscriptions. One is from the southwest of France, modern day France, or Roman Gaul obviously. And the other one is a 9th century Pictish depiction. And when we have these arqueballista, they appear to be used in hunting scenes. The Romans didn't use the weapon we today call the crossbow, the arqueballista, in warfare. It wasn't seen as a war weapon. They would have larger ballistas and stuff like that, which were used in warfare. And in the late Roman period, we have references of those being mounted on chariots or on carts and used basically in conflict in the 5th century, especially against people like the Huns and stuff like that. But the crossbow or the arqueballista in the 3rd century is a hunting weapon. It does have a huge, powerful hit though, and would have been possibly an effective weapon, but it wasn't seen as a war weapon at the time. So it's an interesting one that they've included this, and maybe it's a part of a hunting scene in the film, and I can forgive Ridley Scott and stuff like that. But again, I'm having a feeling that it's a weapon that's managed to find its way in. But we know that there were crossbows in the first film, so again, maybe it's a reuse of props, or it's a reference back to the first film as well. So there's an interesting one right there. But as an attempt on the life of an emperor, that for me is basically like a no-go. That's not one that we could probably accept as an event that would be allowed to happen. We then get some nice scenes of the Senate, and from that we can presume that there's going to be like some backstabbing, some politics. As I mentioned before, with the Senate not getting on with Caracalla in real life and his father Septimius Severus, again it's not too much of a stretch to believe that the Senate would be trying to kill off the Geta and Caracalla within the films because of the fact that obviously they would see them as tyrants and stuff like that. So there's an interesting one there to have a play around with and have a think about as well. Now after the Senate scenes, obviously we get some scenes of Pedro Pascal's character, the tensions there, and some of the difficulties between him and other characters as well. But then we go back to fighting in the arena, and we see Lucius fighting against what appears to be 4 or 5 soldiers. Now they are equipped with the Niederbiber, and I think this is amazing because it's a wonderful example where maybe it's part of the props department or something like that has come along and they've searched maybe online for a 3rd century Roman soldier and they've actually seen a Niederbiber, and so even if it's plastic or stuff like that, they've taken the form of the Niederbiber helmet and they've actually used it on the soldiers, and I think that is wonderful. It's something that should be encouraged. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's a beginning, it's a first step. And as I talked about earlier when we're talking about the 3rd century soldier versus the 1st and 2nd century soldier, we're starting to see transitions, movements and changes in the way the Roman soldier looked. So I think that's a great one there, and I hope more of Hollywood will start doing things like that, where they'll research, they'll look at the actual historical information and they'll go forwards from there to create new and exciting films using historical evidence and historical items to really get the actual sense of what's going on. From about 2 minutes 30 onwards to about just under 3 minutes, we start seeing senses of rebellion coming through. And this is led by Denzel Washington's character. And Denzel Washington's character is called Marcinus. Now he's actually based on a usurper in the crisis of the 3rd century. Now what happens is after Septimius Severus's dynasty dies out, what occurs is that there is a period of 50 years of civil war in the Roman Empire. And as I've mentioned earlier, I'm doing a series on Roman politics, so if you stay subscribed to the channel, you'll actually be able to see some of that and talk about the crisis and what was going on and the change in Roman politics that occurred throughout the crisis of the 3rd century. But ultimately, with this crisis, we see like usurpers lasting for a year or less. 2 years is about average, but some of them only last 7 years, some of them last a few months. But with this character here, Denzel Washington's character, we're seeing a guy who's based on one of the usurpers. So maybe this idea is that Ridley Scott is now showing the crises and some of that element as well. Though obviously he's probably going to create a stable democracy or restore the Republic rather than the tyranny of these terrible Geta and Caracalla, these characters that he's built. his terrible ginger love child. So you can see my opinion about the depiction there of those two coming through. But it's an interesting one all the same. He's showing the instability that the 3rd century really had on the Roman Empire, where actually at points the Roman Empire split into 3, and there was a Gallic Empire, which was Britain, France, and the sort of the northern and western parts of the empire. There was the central part, which was Italy, the Dalmatian coast and North Africa, and the eastern part, which was the Palmyran Empire as well. And these 3 were not separate empires, they were still Roman empires, but they were ruling in the Roman style and had basically the fact that there was this split, this tension where the empire had to deal with regional issues. But it led to usurpers controlling different parts of the empire until it was reunited under Aurelian, who was a saviour of the empire, until obviously he was assassinated too. So it was a real period of instability in the 3rd century. So that's an interesting one there. So I'm hoping that the film touches on that a little bit, but I have a feeling that it may not be the case. The trailer then ends obviously with Pedro Pascal's character fighting against Lucius in the arena and dual wielding, which is obviously a Hollywood favourite. Obviously fighting without a shield reduces your protection to yourself a lot, and I would just suggest that, you know, they would often, instead of doing dual wielding, which obviously looks cool, they should instead focus upon sword and shield fighting, which might be slower but be quite cool overall. But that was just one of the things that I noticed at the end of the trailer. It just was like, oh yeah, dual wielding again, it's Hollywood. Obviously they're going to do that. But sword and shield, or you know, sword and board as it's often described within reenactment fighting, is much preferable in many ways. And they could still choreograph something very exciting and very interesting from that too. So coming to the end now of this episode, I wanted to talk about my personal feelings. This isn't obviously supposed to be a historical reconstruction of the lives of Septimius Severus, Geta, Caracalla, all of that. It's not supposed to be that. This is a piece of entertainment. I may be impassioned about the Roman history, about, obviously, you know, if you watch the channel for a while, I do Roman reenactment, and I love this period of history. I love the colour, the emperors, the characters, the military equipment, the civilian equipment, the development of rural estates and villas, and the Roman Empire itself with its urban cities, and the conflict between emperors and senators, and all of that stuff. It's captivating, and that's, you know, the joke that came out earlier in the year of how often you think about the Roman Empire. Well, with my job, quite often, to be honest, but like there's this really interesting sort of play there. And so when I see Gladiator 2, there was a part of me that really felt, because I was just like, this is going to be another Hollywood Roman epic with leather armor and all of that sort of stuff, and the stereotypes of democracy versus totalitarianism, and it misses the mark of what Roman politics was actually about, and the loyalty of the people towards emperors, and the idea of emperors was really, really strong throughout the whole of the imperial period. So that's something that is always a tension, and you want the military equipment to be reflective of the actual late Roman legions and the crisis of the 3rd century and the earlier period, and for the costumes to be colourful and to have the bright colours and the decorations that we see throughout the Roman period. But with it being a Hollywood film as well, we know that they have limitations. Obviously the actors need to be comfortable, they need to have health and safety, they can't have the actors getting injured or stuff like that. So there's some elements where realism needs to be held against the health and safety that is required for the actors, for the shows, all of that sort of stuff. So I can forgive that because it's a piece of entertainment. Now, ultimately, from watching the trailer, and I mentioned at the start, 3 minutes is a hefty trailer, and I felt quite, I felt as if I could develop an opinion of what the film's going to be like from the trailer, because they showed me so much. And I have to say, it's going to be a bit like Dune Part 2 for me. Dune Part 2 was absolutely beautiful. It was an amazingly beautiful film. But the problem was that I knew how it was going to end from the start. They told us at the start what's going to happen, and then you watch it play out, and at the end, obviously, you have Paul coming out and sending them all out to conquer the universe, and you have that massive war, and it's been shown in dreams and visions and all of that stuff from Part 1 and in Part 2 as well. And eventually it just happens, and you're like, oh, okay. So you have this beautiful cinematic, you know, well played out, interesting film, but it's boring. And I felt that in the film. I was watching it, I just felt bored because I was like, I know what's going to happen next. There's no excitement. And I feel with a 3-minute trailer that I can comfortably say that Gladiator 2 is going to be a remake of Gladiator 1 with better CGI and with new actors and characters. Rather than it being a new story that continues things, it feels like it's going to be a continuation, and especially in the last 2 minutes and 2 minutes 50 seconds of the actual cinematic trailer, we see scenes that look as if they were directly lifted out of Gladiator 1, but with just the character of Lucius in the place of Maximus. Now I feel that that's missing out, and maybe it's a case of that this is what we expect in the 2020s, where nostalgia seems to be a big thing in Hollywood, and there's that harking back to, oh, do you remember Gladiator 1? It was so great, here's Gladiator 2, which is just a scene-for-scene remake with some new characters and a wee bit of updated elements within it. And I feel that that maybe misses out on what we could have had, what could have been exciting, what could have been different. Ultimately, when it comes out in November, we'll see what we actually get. It'll be interesting to see if the film matches up, and my birthday's in November, so I might actually go and see it as a birthday treat. Or I might just wait until it's obviously online on a streaming service and watch it at home and save myself a wee bit of money and time and things like that. Because the problem as well is that because of my studies, my area of interest and things like that, going to watch these Hollywood Roman films can often be painful for me, because I'm sitting there going, oh, why did they do that? Why did they do this? And it can take away the fun. Anyone who wants to watch Gladiator 2 just to enjoy it because it's a Hollywood film, it's going to be a big epic and it's got the Roman flavour that you want in it, then go for it. Enjoy yourself. Have fun, because ultimately it's a piece of entertainment for you to enjoy. And the reason why I did this episode wasn't to come along and to poo on from a great height down on the film. Instead, the reason why I'm doing it is to sit down and go, here's the historical characters, here's the historical evidence, here's the information that could add to your knowledge, to add to your love of this period, and to flesh out the actual world that Gladiator's set in. And I hope that you've enjoyed this video and this episode because of it. At the end of every episode, obviously I say if you haven't already liked and subscribed, please do, because it helps the channel grow. Share the video with your friends. And if you'd like to support me further, I do also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi account, which you can find down in the description. Ultimately, I hope you have been entertained. There we go, fitted it in again. And that you have enjoyed this episode and learned something else. Have a polite conversation down in the comments section, and I look forward to seeing you in another episode in the near future. Until then, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching.